Let's make sense of this.
Let's make sense.
Sensemakers.
Hey, Keith and Jonathan, welcome back. Covering today 1.3 in database approach. So I'm at Montgomery. I have the Alteryx Expert Exam certification locked down, and I want to give you some steps to be able to pass that. So in the first video, I covered using Alteryx. If you have the ability to connect to a database, if you have the ability to configure some tools, there's some ways that you can get some experience with some Alteryx native tools that aren't going to be something that you know with SQL. The second video on practice was around SQL syntax, different databases, how to write different expressions, as well as going over some of the keywords Alteryx wants you to know. So in this video, what I really want to do is I really want to explain my approach and then be able to get your feedback on, how you would handle that or what we can do. So the first element, of course, is to practice. It goes without saying, you want to put in time. But it's not necessarily about putting in time. You want to put in efficient time. You want to be sharp with how you spend your time. If you have 2 hours or 1 hour to study, if you have the ability to use Alteryx, get comfortable with managed connections, get comfortable with data streaming, get comfortable writing database or writing to a database. If you have the ability to go to LeetCode or some other equivalent website, I would practice writing select statements, where statements, join statements, casts, converts, wildcards, all those components I covered in video 1 and video 2. That's how I would spend your time. I would layer in a little bit of documentation, and then some videos that Alteryx has provided are good supplements as well. Jonathan, I know you have a lot of experience working with SQL, writing SQL, living in that world.
Mm-hmm.
What are things that come to mind whenever you've had to practice it that works for you?
One of the things to me is use a data set or a data set that's small enough that you can wrap your brain around it. So something with 100 columns, that's a data type, kind of data that you don't know, and millions of rows is just too big. So keep it small so you know what you're up to. Like the database you showed us in the second video was 4 columns, perfect to try things out on and see how to do things with it. So that's the main thing that comes to me. And then we talked a bunch in the other videos about just different kinds of SQL are different. They're going to potentially test you on the database, different kinds of databases. Make the same mistake in different databases to see the error messages, because it's one of the things that drives me crazy with SQL and why I am an Alteryx user, so I don't have to write SQL. But just that the error messages in SQL are so not what the problem is. Whereas with Alteryx tools, it's really easy to go, oh, I screwed this up and I can fix it right away. So to just see what happens a little bit in there. But it doesn't take much, but just to have that sense.
The next component I want to have is follow instructions closely. So the first bullet, practice all the things I've covered, the things that Keith has covered, the stuff Jonathan has covered. That's all prep. That's all getting you ready to solve the problem.
Can I add one thing to this?
Of course.
Is with SQL is so doing the connection information is can be so particular just to get to the database. Doing that SQL code, one little comma out of place can be like that. So having this one really stands out to me, maybe more so than anything else that we might be doing in the exam.
Right. And so I guess I would just chime in here to say, just because SQL can hang you up because you've got a semicolon in the wrong place, right? Like there's a grain of sand that's holding up the entire freight train. doesn't mean you need to be afraid of these tools or these questions on the exam, but actually you could strategically use these questions on the exam and choose these on purpose in order to win yourself time for the more difficult stuff, because it seems to me pretty fairly telegraphed. Like, this is what we're going to want you to do. We want you to be able to connect to in database. We want you to be able to use these sets of tools. We want you to be able to stream in some stuff that came in a flat file, demonstrate that you know how to do stuff in database, and, kind of blockle, tackle, get through it, and just demonstrate that you know the tool. And so they're not, what I heard you say, Matthew, is asking you to solve a big dynamics complex problem. That's in other locations. And so if you dedicate this practice time, it sounds to me like this can be sort of like a Lynch set of questions that you can just knock out pretty quickly if you can do it.
Yeah, I would encourage it. This is definitely one of the questions I would say, if you take the exam, you should be able to make an attempt on this question. I won't say that about every question, because there are some that are just very challenging, require a decent amount of tribal knowledge, or very deep configuration settings that, if you don't have practice or experience with, can be prohibitive. Nothing that you're going to be presented with here as a single step or a task is going to be too challenging. The most challenging components are going to be setting up your connection, streaming data in, how you're going to do it, where you're going to write it, and just following their instructions. They want you to get the problem right. Take your time, little steps, you're good to go. The final area I want to cover, though, is something I haven't said yet, but I think is the real linchpin for this problem, and is actually something that helped me get it faster.
Okay.
Sometimes it can be difficult to see what's happening to data in SQL step to step. You get a beginning, you get an end, you can put browses on, but it's kind of inefficient. You have to put a browse everywhere to see what's happening.
Mm-hmm.
What you can do as an approach is you can see maybe how the problem can be solved using standard tools. So while data stream in is a key concept, you can also leverage the data stream out tool to see how the data works, and then potentially solve it, or at least see what's happening to the data with standard tools. So you can at least picture what's happening if you're not the most comfortable in SQL, or what's happening with your outer join, maybe, where you're blending two data sets and you don't know where the nulls are going to show up, or how that's going to impact your values, or you don't necessarily know if you wrote the formula the way you needed to. It doesn't give you an error, but it doesn't necessarily confirm what you got it right. So I think just being able to stream it out, if you're clearly comfortable in the standard tools, like if you have the advanced cert, it requires practical problems being solved. You can solve it using that ecosystem, and then think about converting it, because ultimately you have to present your answer, your solution, as a workflow in database and writing it to a database. That is required. But if you can just make it a little easier and start with something that you know, and then just map it to, like, okay, this is the formula I have to write, this is the filter I have to write, this is the join I have to write, and I'm comfortable with the Alteryx syntax, then it makes the SQL journey a little easier, knowing I'm just going A to A, B to B, C to C, versus sometimes building all these steps in SQL. It's another language. You don't see the data as it comes along. It can be overwhelming. And if you get stuck, it can be pretty tough to know where that's happening, especially if you don't get a clear error code.
But then I remember, like some of the data, are the data sets really big? Because one of the reasons why, philosophically I'm going to work in databases is I don't want to move the mass over the wire, bring it to my local machine. And so if they're having me work on these very large data sets in database, I can imagine that bringing it over the wire to my local machine and working on it in memory could also kind of trip me up.
Of course. I don't want to speculate on the size of data or the amount of data you have to work with, but you can sample it. Take a subset. Look at 100 records. See functionally what's happening. Understand mechanically what are you trying to accomplish, and try and do it with the least amount of data possible. Because, yeah, if you're working with 100 records, that's pretty easy with standard tools. If the database has 10 million rows, which can happen, you don't have to work with 10 million rows. Just maybe have an efficient sample. Maybe stream out 100 at a time, put on a filter, and just target a subset of your data to focus on. Because that's really what you're trying to do. You're trying to get a sample of the solution. You're not necessarily trying to solve it for each row. Just solve it for a component that's holding you up.
That makes sense. Yep. So bring just out what I need, use the in-memory tools as my scratch pad. Now I know what I need to do, translate that back into the in-database tools for the win. Okay.
Yep. Yeah, this is how I learned how to use the in-database tools myself.
Okay.
Like I knew Alteryx, yes, I knew SQL, but how do the in-database tools work? So it's not only a life hack for doing the exam, it's a life hack for learning this part of Alteryx. Yeah,
For sure.
Yeah,
and
this is great.
Yeah. Right. And it kind of gets into the scaffolding concept of start with something you know, build with something you know, and then just try to minimize the gaps between where you are currently to where you need to go. Because you're going to start from the beginning and you got to get to an end. There's going to be a lot of steps in between. But if you can mitigate some of those steps and get some quick wins and get some easier understanding, now you've reduced your risk. Now you have fewer areas that you need to worry about. And if you test along the way and just go tool to tool, select to select, filter to filter, formula to formula, join to join, and just check it each step of the way, it might seem like a lot, but if you do that each step, you're preventing errors that come up with when you start chaining tools together, when you start chaining 6 operations in a row and not test it. That's where you can have big problems because you don't know if it happened in tool 1, tool 2, tool 3. It sounds oversimplistic, but it will mechanically go so much faster than you think, because if you're not spending 20% of your time on debugging, but you're spending 30 seconds to a minute, like, I can't get past this tool, I'm done, I just won't get past this tool until it's fixed, you go on to the next one. I'm getting the same record counts, I'm getting the same values, boom, I can move on to the next one. And then you just kind of clear it. And then next thing you know, you get to a point where you're done and you look up and you're like, that was 20 minutes. That was 25 minutes. I'm ahead of my pace.
Yeah, I'm seeing a real opportunity here. And I'm also picking up your structured approach to risk management as a key theme here, not just for these in-database tools, but for the exam in general. I mean, I've heard you say about like, just manage your risk on knowing the syntax of how these different things function. Manage your risk on being able to work it out in memory and then port the solution to in-database. Manage your risk on like having a pace and knowing where you are according to the clock so that you can like throw something back into your subliminal mind and come back to it later and move on to something else. Manage your risk on having one action per tool and not trying to play tool golf, as you mentioned, to do everything all in one place. So manage your risk in order to being able to know where and how to debug. I mean, that to me is really one of these sort of key critical kind of strategies that you're putting down.
Yep. And something I want to note is I have had a chance to interact and interface with some world-class developers and users. The thing that makes experts is they're just very quick at knowing how to connect A, B, C, D, E, F, G efficiently. It's not that they're going A, then the C, then the F, then the I. Like, they're not skipping steps. They're consolidating steps just very quickly, and it might not be intuitive to the eye, but that's really what makes people fast at this stuff, and that's what makes people good, is they know all the steps. They're just better at going A to B to C to D to E to F in order, is they can break it down into small steps, and they know how these small steps and they know how these components go together, and it's much more logical, and it's much easier to not only debug, but then have confidence in your answer that, like, sentence A, sentence B, sentence C, sentence D, so on and so forth.
That was one of the key sentences you said in the practice episode just before, is that when there's a problem, knowing where to go to find it and fix it. And this small step approach and being able to just run quickly through a series of small steps helps you to isolate, okay, there's a problem at step C, but I know exactly where it is, as opposed to all of these things being, conjoined in one single big mess.
And it's going to be a temptation. You know that the clock is against you. It's going to be tempting to skip steps or consolidate steps. It's going to be tempting to be like, I can just ram through 4 statements in a filter. I know I have to do these 4 filters. I don't want to do 4 tools. I just want to do it in one. You can get it right. You're introducing risk. And for this exam, I recommend trying to minimize risk and take a little bit longer to do a lot more smaller steps because mistakes will happen. You will get tired. You'll get distracted. You will put a problem down and you'll keep thinking about it and go to another one. There's too many other things going on. The last thing you want to do is have to exhaust any more brain power than you need. So keeping things simple and keeping things small requires less brain power. So that's going to make it just that much easier.
Love it.
Yeah. I love the way this made, for me at least, it seems like this piece really shows okay, even if this is an area of Alteryx that you don't know, it's more accessible and something you can actually take the exam on. So I'm excited for the rest of the videos.
I am as well.
Yeah.
I really appreciate y'all joining me for this in database series. Once again, we got Read Watch that's going to cover documentation, some Alteryx syntax. We've got part 2 that's going to cover ways to practice. And then just once again, you can take this approach video, season it in with how you approach exams. Everybody takes them differently. But I think that you got some hopefully some helpful hints that'll get you on your way to a pass.
Okay. Thanks, Matthew.
Thank you.
Yep. We'll see you again for the next
All right.
one.
All right.
See you on the next one.
Let's make sense of this.
Let's make sense.